So again, good afternoon to our viewers in the US, in Germany, Europe, and I think we even have a few participants from Asia. So good morning or good evening, good morning to you as well, of course. Welcome to our event, How the Pandemic Impacts News Media. My name is Paul Linnertz. I'm director of the US office of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, or in English, the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. The Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung is a German institution with civic education centers all around Germany and a little bit more than 100 offices worldwide. And we are hosting events also on transatlantic relations, on our close partnership between Europe, Germany, Canada, and the US, around the year, all around the world due to COVID-19, though we had to unfortunately cancel most of our regular events and visiting programs, both here in the US as well as in Europe. Via Zoom and YouTube, fortunately, we are able to stay in touch with you. I mean, this is not replacing in-person meetings, of course. And Tim, I still fondly remember our conference in Chicago about local journalism from a global perspective. Okay, these virtual events are not replacing these in-person meetings, but still, I'm very much looking forward to a very interesting and fruitful discussion today, because we are happy to welcome 4 outstanding experts on media and journalism during our event today. And let me at least briefly try to introduce all of them in alphabetical order. Penelope Penny Moose Abernathy is a former executive at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. And right now, Penny is the Knight Chair in Journalism and Digital Media Economics at the University of North Carolina. A journalism professional with more than 30 years of experience as a reporter, editor, and senior media business executive, Penny specializes in preserving quality journalism by helping news organizations succeed economically in the digital environment. She is the author of News Deserts and Ghost Newspapers: Will Local News Survive? A major 2020 report that documents the state of local journalism, what is at stake for our democracy, and the possibility of reviving the local news landscape. Let's move on to Germany and to Alexandra Borchardt. With more than 25 years of experience in journalism and major news organizations, Alexandra is a journalism professor at the University of the Arts in Berlin and co-leads the Digital Journalism Fellowship at the Hamburg Media School. She is also a senior research associate with the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford in the UK. Alexandra's main focus is digital transformation and how it impacts the media, democracy, the workplace, and human behavior. Just recently, Alexandra has published a new book in German under the title Mehr Wahrheit wagen, warum die Demokratie einen starken Journalismus braucht. In English, literally translated perhaps Daring More Truth, or To Dare More Truth, why democracy needs strong journalism. Back to the US, Tim Franklin is the Senior Associate Dean at Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. Before joining Medill, Tim was the president of the Poynter Institute, a leading international school for journalists and a media think tank. Tim has been the top editor of 3 metropolitan newspapers, and his newsroom won numerous national journalism awards. He began his career at the Chicago Tribune, where he was a reporter and editor for 17 years. Tim is helping lead the Medill Local News Initiative, a research and development project designed to bolster the sustainability of local news in America. Last but not least, Jasmin Off. Jasmin is the deputy editor-in-chief of the German local newspaper Lübecker Nachrichten. Before taking up this position in 2018, she was the digital editor at the Schwäbische Zeitung, another local newspaper in Germany. She has extensive experience as a local reporter and she was a scholarship holder from the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung journalism program. Jasmine studied political sciences, American cultural history, and contemporary German literature in Munich and in Washington, D.C. Thank you all for joining us today. I really appreciate it. During the next, let's say, roughly 30 minutes, during the next half of our online webinar, I'm looking forward to a conversation with my 4 distinguished panelists, to our Zoom participants. If you have a question to our panelists, please use the Q&A. My colleague Jan Bösche will monitor it and will at least try to pick up or pass your questions further to our panelists, or at least as many questions as possible until the end of our online event. Firstly, I will ask one question to each of our panelists from my side. I will jump back and forth between Germany and the US so that all of you get a few minutes for your answers. Yet, if one of the co-panelists would like to add something to one specific question or the answer, please feel free to do so during our conversation. Let's start with Jasmine in Germany. You are in charge of your editorial staff and the daily reporting of the Lübecker Nachrichten, your local newspaper. In a nutshell, what has changed due to Corona? Apart from the economic aspects of the pandemic, do you also notice, let's say, changing attitudes among your readership towards media and journalists? What has changed apart from, let's say, the revenues? Jasmine.
Well, to put it in a nutshell, a lot has changed. Well, basically everything has changed, from our workflows, from our way in the newsroom, how we create content. The speed has changed. Speaking of the readers, I think in the beginning, there has been some criticism that we put content that was related to coronavirus, or when we were reporting about Corona, behind the paywall. So people were saying, you cannot do this. This is essential information. This is life essential information indeed. And we cannot charge for that. That has entirely changed, actually. It has turned around. And now when some readers, if you look through the Facebook comment section, still argue you have to put this for free on your website, then other readers would actually jump in and say, wait, but you also go to the supermarket and pay for food, right? And this is essential for life as well. So why don't you pay for journalism? So actually, we have less work to do in arguing why we charge money for our news and for our work. And a lot of the readers have seen, I think, in the last few months, why our work is essential, why it's worth paying for online journalism. It also has changed a lot in the newsroom, of course, the way we work together, the way we communicate. We suddenly had WhatsApp groups set up. We had people going into the home offices. Actually, that worked entirely smoothly, or surprisingly smoothly. Kind of scary also that you can imagine now that the newspaper and all our products, print, digital, are made with not one single person within the newsroom, but with everyone working from home. So yes, it kind of turned our publishing house upside down, I would say.
Perhaps one follow-up question before I move on to our next panelist. Let's say, has it been easy to have your staff get adjusted to these home office and decentralized way of working?
Fortunately, we were prepared pretty well, although we didn't know about the pandemic, obviously, before that. But everyone had a laptop, everyone had a smartphone, and was ready to go into the home office and work from there remotely quite easily, I would say. But then, of course, we had, or still have, colleagues that suddenly also had their kids at home because of the temporary lockdown of schools and kindergartens. So that was a bit of a problem to get everyone arranged and kind of settled into this new situation. We had some colleagues that said, can we go to the office? Is it not allowed? I really want to go to the office and leave my 4 kids and my husband's at home so I can focus on work. So it took some weeks, I would say, until everyone was really adjusted with the situation. But besides that, it worked pretty well, I'd say. And now with rules getting stricter and numbers rising in Germany as well, there are a lot of colleagues coming up to me and all the other bosses in the departments and asking, actually, when can we go back to the home office? Is this a way for months, actually, not only temporary for a few weeks, but for months or maybe half a year or so, that we can still produce our online content and produce the paper, but be at home.
Thank you, Jasmine. Penny, let's move back to the US. The economic difficulties of, let's say, local media especially are, of course, not new. Many local communities speak of news deserts, huge areas in some places where you wouldn't find any more local news media outlets. Against the backdrop of the corona pandemic, is there any hope for, let's say, traditional independent media?
Well, let me start with what I think is a silver lining in what could be a very dark thundercloud, right? As you mentioned, there were hundreds of newspapers in the US. We have right now about 7,000 newspapers still publishing. We have about 500 digital sites. We have 1,400 public broadcasting outlets and about 1,000 ethnic outlets that we track. And in terms of that, that's a small number. It's down considerably from what we had even 15 years ago. So there's the phenomenon that both we've lost news outlets, both digital and print. And there's the secondary problem in that we've lost journalists. So the silver lining, I think, is that twofold. One, I think it has really impressed upon both ordinary readers and citizens in communities throughout the US what is at stake, not only for our democracy, but also for our society, when we lose that kind of vital news and information about things like public safety, about education. We really rely on our local news organizations to provide that. So that is, I think, an encouraging sign. At least I pick it up. We haven't gotten it yet in terms of national surveys that show it. The latest national survey showed that half of people who responded to a Pew Research Center survey back in 2018 found that they said there was about 50% of them said there was not really local news that applied to them. So I think there's been an increasing relevance as witnessed in the number of digital subscriptions, the number of print subscriptions that soared in the wake of the coronavirus. And on the flip side, we've had legislation kind of languishing in Congress for 2 and 3 and 4 years, and suddenly there's bipartisan support, strong bipartisan support, to at least begin to, in a piecemeal fashion, addressing some of the issues that are here. On the thundercloud, I think that we're going to witness over the next, unless there is some kind of relief, either at the national, state, or level in terms of policy, or at the in terms of nonprofit support, or some other kind of mechanism in which we all as citizens gather around and conclude that something very dire is at stake for our free flow of credible news and information. I think we're going to witness an even stronger and more and steeper decline in the number of news outlets that we have, both digital, print, and eventually even affecting more broadcast outlets than we have. So I think that as I'm a strategist by nature, and a strategist always looks at the glass half full and half empty. I worry about the inequity in many markets, because many of the places where we have news deserts, we have are economically struggling, underserved communities. And that bodes ill if we don't figure out how to get some kind of news and information in there, whether it's publicly financed or nonprofit, or even a for-profit hybrid model of some sort that brings that kind of news and information back to people. So that is the half empty one. And in this big country, the access to digital remains a huge issue in terms of an infrastructure issue. So there are lots of issues that we need to think about and need to address. But I think that the good news is there's an awareness in the US caused by the very severe nature of the pandemic and what it has brought to all of us, of the need to think long-term as well as short-term about how we address it.
Perhaps also one brief follow-up question to you. You've mentioned that things have changed already during the last 15 years. A lot of media outlets disappeared and so on. Do you have any numbers? I mean, and what areas are predominantly affected?
Well, so far it has been newspapers. And what you have to understand is that historically in this vast country of ours, newspapers have been the primary, if not the sole source of local news and information. So when you lose a local newspaper, you're losing the person that shows up to cover the school board or the county commissioner meeting or even the planning board meeting. There's been a corollary loss of journalists at the state and regional level. And what you're losing there are the people who cover the big picture stories that show you how you're related to someone who's in another part of the state in which you share the same problems and possibilities. So we've lost a fourth of all newspapers during the past 15 years. And unfortunately, we thought maybe digital outlets would replace them, but we're just holding still with digital outlets. We've lost as many as come into the market. So there's a real issue around what that sustainable business model is going to be to cover, especially small and mid-sized communities.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. So we've learned already from Jasmine and Penny, there is, let's say, common challenges we face on both sides of the Atlantic. But let's say from your point of view, how would you describe the differences when it comes to the landscape, perhaps not only between Germany and the US, perhaps you can do also have some information about some other countries in Europe.
Yeah, sure, Pearl, I can do it. First of all, let me frame this coronavirus situation actually as an opportunity for local journalism. I'm on Penny's side that way because actually people are craving for news about their community and how it is affected. I'm pretty familiar with the local journalism space all over Europe because I'm also a coach in the Table Stakes Europe program that's been modeled after the Table Stakes program in the US, where actually more than 100 publishers in the US have participated. We launched that with one IFRA last year. In Germany are now a second round now, so I've good insights in what's going on in the newsrooms. And actually the situation in Europe is fortunately a lot better than in the US. This has structural reasons because in the US, lots of publishers gave up, lots of news organizations were bought up by hedge funds or other investors, and they just squeezed all the resources and all the money out of the news organizations. A lot of people were laid off. That situation hasn't happened to that extent in Europe, particularly in Germany, where there's lots of still publisher families that are really holding on to their mission as publishers, and they're trying the best to, make the most out of local journalism and get their local news organizations into digital transformation. And this is an ideal time, obviously, now, because now that people are displaying much more trust towards journalism again because of the coronavirus situation, and they're craving for local news. That is the chance when digital transformation can really kick in and you can really start convincing people that it's worth paying for digital news. You can switch to audience first perspective news coverage. So it is a huge chance to improve your own journalism and at the same time to convince audiences to pay for quality journalism. The second issue here is that obviously in Germany, but in most European countries, we have a strong public service media. That means that we don't have that many news deserts in that sense, because public service is quite common here, and they are on the mission to give everyone access to quality news, quality information. So that is not that much of a problem of people being served with quality news. It is a slightly difficult situation for willingness to pay, obviously, because look at the UK, for example, you have the BBC, that's a major quality news outlet. So in the UK, not that many people, just 7% is the share, are actually willing to pay for digital news. In Germany, 10% of people are willing to pay for digital news. In the US, it's actually 20% about. That's what the digital news report of the Reuters Institute says. So the willingness to pay is much higher where you're afraid of losing your news outlet, your local news outlet even. So actually, yeah, dissatisfaction with the situation in the US is much bigger. So willingness to pay is higher than in Europe, where there's still pretty good service with quality news.
Perhaps, Alexandra, thank you so much. Perhaps since some of our participants might not know so much about German public broadcasting, you would find it all around the place, all around Germany, both in TV, both in radio, and not just one TV or radio channel. You would have, I don't know, 5 radio channels per public broadcasting service, correct?
Well, yeah, and I mean, in Germany, we are a very decentralized country with a strong federal system. So that contributes actually to a pretty decent media environment with different points of view still. Obviously, there's still lots of local news organizations struggling, and I don't want to paint this picture as brightly as it might have appeared here. But I mean, as you, you could, Jasmin told us about Lübecker Nachrichten, which is not a huge newspaper, but they're strong and going and trying to serve their audiences. So papers like that or news organizations like that are everywhere in Germany.
Yeah, and we might need to add that, of course, we also have private TV stations and private radio stations, like in all other countries in Europe, as well as in the US, of course. You've mentioned already, Alexandra, the percentage of people in Germany, the percentage of people in the UK who are willing to pay for, let's say, digital media compared to the percentage in the US. That leads me to my question to Tim. You said, Tim, the pandemic put the digitization of media, I quote, on steroids. Let's start with the US, or let's perhaps focus first on the US. What would you describe as, let's say, possible strategies for media to survive and to perhaps even adapt to the new situation? I still fondly remember, it must have been more than 10 years ago now, when the first US newspapers introduced metered paywalls, and everybody was really, really wondering if that would work. And now a lot of people are simply used to it. So how would you describe the possible strategies for digitization?
Yeah, well, Paul, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be with you and all of the other distinguished panelists today. So to continue with Penny's metaphor about the thunderclouds, I would say that the pandemic has been a Category 5 hurricane for the local news business in the United States. And when a Category 5 blows through, you'd be a fool to rebuild in the same way that you had built before. So what this has done is that it has put on steroids or warp speed or whatever you want to call it, but it has dramatically accelerated the transition from print to digital in local news in the US. This was a transition that was happening already, but it's just dramatically sped it up. So let me give you some statistics on that. We already were transitioning from an advertising-based business model in local news, at least in the US, to a reader revenue business model, or one that's more dependent on digital subscriptions and memberships and donations and the rest. In the salad days back in the 90s, many local news organizations were getting 80% of their revenue from advertising. And now it's almost a complete reversal. 70–80% of the revenue at many news organizations are now coming from reader revenue or from readers. So this has really sped up the pivoting of the business model from one that is centered on advertising to one that's focused on reader revenue. And I actually think that's a good thing. In many ways, an advertising-based business model online is premised in large part on clickbaity page views, generating headlines and stories that will bring a lot of one-time readers to your site and then generate programmatic advertising revenue. What's happening now and in some ways it's like the oldest form of capitalism that you can imagine, is local news organizations are having to build a quality product that people are willing to pay for. So there's a premium on journalistic excellence, on original, unique, original local reporting that people will turn over their credit card for and are willing to pay for. So I think that this is really shifting the whole idea of how local news organizations are raising revenue. And then the other thing that we've really seen, and there was a big announcement just yesterday about this, is there's a reduction in print frequency of newspapers in the US. The Salt Lake Tribune just announced yesterday that it's going from daily, which it's been since 1871, to a weekly. Earlier this year, the Tampa Bay Times, which is one of the best regional newspapers in the United States, won multiple Pulitzer Prizes. It went from 7-day-a-week daily printing to just 2 days a week. Virtually the entire McClatchy chain, the second largest local news publisher in the US, has gone from 7 days to 6 days. And I think that trend is going to accelerate because it cuts costs. It cuts the cost. It's much less expensive to produce local news digitally than it is to print, manufacture, and distribute a newspaper that gets tossed onto people's driveways or onto their front porches. And the three biggest costs of local news organizations are print, are people, paper, and distribution. And if you eliminate those paper costs and the distribution costs, it's much more efficient for news organizations to operate.
Perfect. Thank you, Tim. Since this is a rather unique opportunity to speak about these media challenges, both from a US perspective as well as from the European point of view, I also have one follow-up question to you, Tim, and then perhaps some of our distinguished panelists might add to that. When you speak about reader revenue, and you said already that has changed profoundly, does it also include things like e-papers, for example, and how do, let's say, social media play into this kind of new model or that kind of new reader revenue strategy? And the second issue, and I would ask the same question to our colleagues in Germany, is how do young people actually react, or let's say from the demographic point of view? I mean, let's say my generation, we grew up having our parents read newspapers, real newspapers at the breakfast table, and so on and so on. And but these things have changed anyway, not just due to Corona. I mean, young people tend to be more digital. And how is, let's say, the demographic change among the readership, having them use much more social media and so on? So how is that affecting media in the US?
Yeah, boy, I could talk about that all day, but I won't. You know, in terms of e-papers or kind of Ereplica editions, there's been a surge of readership of those. I think not just in the US, but I've read also in Europe as well. And just one quick example, which Penny's also very familiar with, is the Arkansas Democrat Gazette in Little Rock, Arkansas, which stopped printing its newspaper 6 days a week and trained and converted its readers to iPads, which it gave to its subscribers. They basically said, we will give you an iPad if you will subscribe to our publication, but read it digitally on an iPad instead of a printed newspaper. And we just did research, readership research with that news organization, and they've had really tremendous success and have been able to convert readers from print to iPads. It's really kind of an incredible story. So to answer that question, yes, we're seeing more e-editions. The second part of your question in terms of the younger readers and use of social media, there's a more complex answer to that, which I'll try to boil down, and my fellow panelists may want to add to this as well. But younger readers are much more likely to go to Instagram or Twitter or Facebook to get local news and information. And the one thing about that is that it's sometimes hard to distinguish what's real and what isn't, what's verified information and what isn't. It's all just information that gets intermingled on a news feed at the same time. But the one thing about younger readers is that they're now used to paying monthly for subscriptions. They may be paying for Netflix or Hulu or Spotify or Apple Music or whatever, but we're building a routine among millennials and Gen Zs to pay for media, to pay for content on a monthly basis. So I think from that perspective, it's encouraging for the future of local news to have that generation be building that habit now.
Thanks, Tim. I'll address Alexandra and Jasmine to get back to that answer from the German or European perspective. But first, Penny, what would you like to add?
I think this is a great question. And I think there are two kind of merging trends here. One, you've got, and I tend to focus more on the smaller papers than Tim does. And many of the smaller papers have already been weekly. So what they're dealing with is the challenge of how do you put out daily digital news. So you have many weeklies that are moving to digital newsletters. The interesting thing about the newsletters, most of those don't work on a reader subscription basis. Their goal is to bring in more readers. We've done extensive study on a small community down in North Carolina that puts out two newsletters. One is the typical news headlines newsletters. The other was one conceived about 3 years ago because there were a ton of military families moving into the area. It's called Sway. I have no idea why it's called Sway, but anyway, it's called Sway, and it tends to focus on fun kind of, here's a fun, interesting way to think about what's going on in the community. It has attitude, it has a whole range of things. When we did surveys on both of those newsletters, what we found is that the daily newsletter for traditional subscribers enhances their sense of belonging to a community. That is the same thing that happens with Sway. Both of those are paid for by advertisers, sponsored by advertisers, so they're free. The same thing happens with Sway, but people learn about Sway not from the newspaper, but from a friend who says, hey, look at this, I saw this, or they recommend Sway as a good way to begin to get familiar with the community. So I think it's interesting to think about journalism, not just connecting us to our democracy, but connecting us to our community. And I think that is the wonderful thing about focusing again on what we're providing readers versus the fact that we're selling our readers to our advertisers because advertisers want to reach them. So in that way, there's another silver lining, I think, that causes us to turn upside down yet again, and in the right place, I would say, the hourglass for how we think about journalism in the 21st century.
Thank you, Penny. Before we open up the floor to questions from the audience, Alexandra, from Germany or Europe, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I would like to add what Tim said about the young readers, and that is in fact good news. And that's also something that we studied with the Digital News Report at the Reuters Institute. That's the world's largest ongoing survey on news consumption habits. And we call them the Spotify and Netflix generation, because they are in fact willing to pay for digital products. The downside to it is obviously that they are much more demanding than they used to be, because they can actually compare. They're much less loyal to one brand, but they like to have access to different brands, and they like to compare, and then they don't feel, they're not satisfied to just reading one news outlet. So that makes it a lot harder. And the other downside to it is they're not willing to pay that much. So if you charge them whatever, $5 or $10 maximum, that might be it. But just thinking about it, a print subscription, a quality newspaper print subscription in Germany, for example, costs something between, depending on the region, between 30 and 50 euros per month. And now you have this really low willingness to pay. Then again, the good thing is also that it all, and Tim also said that, comes back to quality journalism, because what are people willing to pay for? What are young people willing to pay for? They're willing to pay for something that they don't get anywhere else. So the ambitions of the newsrooms should be there to really produce high quality journalism that's really distinctive, and that they're getting away from the clickbaity stuff that you can have everywhere, and that will probably improve journalism as a whole.
Thank you so much. Jasmine, I'm sure you won't, you can't explain all the ideas the Lübecker Nachrichten, your newspaper, are developing right now, but perhaps also from your side, what are at least a few ideas or a few things you notice when it comes to readership changes?
Well, I totally agree with Penny, because we just launched a lot of newspapers in the last couple of months. We started with one that was actually built around content about coronavirus, very centered around one topic. Then we broadened it up, had suddenly local newspapers for all of our local departments. Now we have a newsletter written by women about women topics. It's not only for women subscribers, men can also subscribe, of course, but it's very focused on strong women in the north of Germany, where our newspapers read. So we try a lot of different things here with newspapers, actually. And I just want to go back to what Tim just said, and Alexandra. I think, yes, it is encouraging that the young people that are subscribing for a digital edition are used to unfortunately, on the other side, they're also very used to unsubscribing very quickly. And so we saw staggering numbers for our digital subscription in March, April, May, but also really sharp drop now during the summer. And now numbers are rising again, but I feel like my and my colleagues' hardest challenge right now is how can we keep those readers? How can we convince them that we're not only reporting well about this pandemic on one day or 1 week, but that we're there as their partner, as someone who reports about not only about the pandemic all the time, but also about other topics. And if we compare this to our print subscribers, they're probably subscribed once and got a coffee machine on top as a bonus, and their relatives probably cancel the subscription once they die. And this is totally the other way around with digital subscription. And I feel this is really a challenge for us.
And let's say, how do you engage with your readers? I mean, to have them continue to use the newspaper?
I feel like a lot of media outlets actually in Germany during the last few months have discovered that they once had a comment section. I feel like this was kind of new, well, not new, they already had it, but they discovered that it was a good instrument to be in touch with your readers, that they answer what you were asking them about the pandemic, like how they feel, how they're handling home office, how they're feeling during the lockdown. So how to get back in touch with your readers, kind of had a like a renewal, I would say. Also, the newsletters help us a lot, actually, not only to bring in new subscribers, but also to kind of keep them, because they get the newsletter every day, and so we can make sure that they see our topics, read our topics every day, compared to if they come to the homepage maybe every 5 or 6 days. So with the newsletter, we have an instrument to have them go back to the homepage and to all our products. We also do more on social media now. We unfortunately don't have a TikTok account yet, so I really want to launch this. But we're doing more on Instagram, obviously, to reach out to the younger audience, and yeah, trying our best on all those social media channels.
Thank you, Jasmine. I would now like to hand it over to my colleague Jan Bösche. Jan, any questions from your side to our panelists or from our participants?
Yes, we got a question from Bangkok, actually, Paul and Tim asking from there. They're asking how much COVID-19 has affected the coverage of the election here in the country, especially on the local level.
Who would like to start? Tim, Penny?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's affected it hugely on a number of levels. One is that, you know, just in terms of practice and process, it's harder for journalists, obviously, to report because of COVID. Some of the most important stories that journalists can do are the on-the-road stories, where they're traveling, talking to regular voters around the country, and really getting a sense for a feel of what's happening. And obviously, because of the pandemic, travel is more limited, and it's much more difficult to do those types of stories. So I think, news organizations that can afford it have become more reliant on surveys and polling maybe than they would be otherwise, because reporting from the road is just that much more challenging. And then I think also it's just taken over the news cycle, especially recently. There's another surge of COVID-19 in the United States. We're seeing record hospitalizations in many more states in the US. So there's much more focus on a singular topic than I think I've seen in some other presidential elections, and I've been involved in them for a long time. So I think that's made it different as well. And from a local news perspective, I would also say that I think it's led to more engagement of citizens with their local news organizations. One of the paradoxes of this period is that there's never been, maybe since World War II, greater interest in local news than there is now. At the same time, the financial model is collapsing. But I do think that there's tremendous demand for local news and information about this election. And so from that perspective, I think it's a good thing. And I think we're also going to see, and we're already seeing just a humongous turnout of voters in the United States. Just this morning, we surpassed more than half of the level of people who voted in 2016, just with people voting early. So I think that there's also greater interest, because I think people see that government literally affects your public health.
Thank you. Anything to add, Penny?
Yeah, let me just add one thing. I think that we started seeing it in 2016, and I think what we're seeing very definitely in 2020 is that continual erosion of reporters, right? We lost more than half of all newspaper reporters over the last decade. And what that has done is affected coverage of both local and state elections. And it's just that they're not being covered now. I mean, it's very hard. I live 80 miles south of Chapel Hill, out in a very rural area, and it's almost impossible to get any kind of information on even the congressional candidates. So, and gosh knows, if you want to figure out where the school board candidates are and what they think about COVID and whether the schools should be reopening, good luck from all of that. And that is where I think it is. There's a need for that. We have that need for it, and I think that it's very apparent with COVID right now of what we've lost over the last decade here.
Thank you, Jan.
Yes, we have another question about COVID, perhaps. Mis and disinformation about COVID runs rampant on social media. You already talked a little bit about the role of social media. So what role can news media organizations play to fight this wrong information out there?
So you have 2 more minutes. Alexander.
Yeah, the most important thing that I usually say with this topic is, don't let others set your complete news agenda. Please keep on producing quality journalism, set the agenda yourself, do investigative reporting, and don't let others sort of hunt you, chase you, because that's the biggest danger, that journalists jump on every tweet that's out there and try to verify everything and every kind of information that's out there, and that consumes huge amounts of resources. And the most important thing for journalists is really, keep a clear head and think about this. Do I really have to address this? Do I have to really fact check everything and tell people this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong? Because you're also running the danger of even amplifying misinformation when you deal that way. I'm not saying here don't verify stuff, but please don't really cut down on your reporting resources, because what Penny says is a tremendous issue that actually this is the talent issue, and this is going to be a huge challenge for journalism, because there's many reasons why young people don't even think about becoming journalists. I mean, the trust debate is one thing. The other thing is they have just different role models these days. They might just opt for being an influencer on YouTube or Instagram, and they don't see these journalism role models any longer. Also, if they have tech talent, and newsrooms desperately need tech talent, they are more attracted to going to Google or Facebook or joining other tech companies. So there's lots of reasons why young people don't want to become journalists. So this is really stretches the resources of journalism, of newsrooms. So the most important thing for newsrooms is really keep on reporting and keep on producing quality journalism, and don't chase every tweet.
Yeah, thank you, Alexandra. If we do have a few more minutes at the end, I would definitely get back to you and to our panelists from the US, asking about, let's say, the challenges for capacity building when it comes to journalism. But perhaps, Jasmine, first from your side, information, disinformation, all these things about Corona, how do you guys handle that issue?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important that you are out there in the social media comments section to argue with the readers, to not only use it as a, what's it called, a lane with dead end, what's it called? I don't know. Like you not only put your content there and you hope that people click on it, but you're also really encouraging them that they engage, and you want something back, you ask them questions, and you're out there. Well, secondly, I think in some parts we cannot really control this, because speaking to a lot of our younger readers, especially, they tell us that all this fake news content comes over sources like WhatsApp and messenger services, where we as journalists, or we as Lübecker Nachrichten, we cannot be. We cannot put out there our content, but we also cannot control what's going on there. So yeah, it's a daily struggle, and I think the only thing we can do is to make sure, as Alexandra said, that our sources are checked, that our facts are straight, right, and our content is the way we can actually justify it, and then be out there and talk and discuss with our readers.
Mm-hmm. Moving back to the US, Penny, you already touched upon the issue, in other words, about credibility of media, but given that situation due to Corona, the demand for information, for quality information, do your statistics notice already some changes when it comes to, let's say, the attitudes of audiences, readership towards, when it comes to credibility of media?
Well, one of the good things is that the Knight Foundation has been tracking trust in media. And when you separate out national media or national news sources from local ones, there's a much higher level of trust in local media. And part of that has had to do with the fact that those are issues that are more relevant to you. You're looking for that kind of information. The bad news, and we only have it since last year, the bad news is it's been declining over a period, the same period. It just hasn't gone as low as national news outlets have gone. So I think there is a good solid foundation on which to build, right? We don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater on this, so that people are looking for that. I think the other issue that we found too is that one of the studies we did in our 2020 study was, we said, what happens when an algorithm chooses your news? So we looked at 340,000, I think it was, local news items that Facebook had provided in its local news feed. What we found is an overwhelming majority of those really concerned kind of one-off crimes or kind of crazy, fun stories that got shared a lot, but they didn't really answer the questions that people wanted. So I think there is there's a real conundrum. I'm glad to hear what Jasmine said about that kind of notion of actually getting on and trying to provide the information, because too often I think what goes on in what comes into your news feed off social media, and even what comes on when you do a search, tends to be very distorted. and it's driven by an algorithm, not by the good news judgment of a news editor.
Thank you so much. Jan, any further questions from our participants?
Yes, we got an interesting question about the relationship between local media and perhaps established media and social media. So the question is, when young people say, I get my news on social media, in how many cases do they in fact get news from established media through this channel? Is there a measurement? Can one say how much, how important that is?
Tim, would you like?
Sure, and it is a very good question. I mean, there have been some studies that show, especially with younger readers on social media, that they get more news and information from friends and from family than from legacy news organizations. It's really, and I think generally with older readers, they tend to rely more on brand names, news organizations that they're used to. There's some interesting technological solutions, maybe not solutions, but aids to this issue. So in the United States, there's an organization now called Newsguard, which was founded by Stephen Brill, who's the publisher of American Lawyer and started Court TV, and as well as the former publisher of the Wall Street Journal. And so with a bit of information, there's a web browser plugin, and if it's a legitimate news organization with an ethics policy and so forth, there'll be a green check mark by that link or by that bit of information. If it's from a disreputable source, there may be a red shield that pops up on your screen, but it's this visual prompt about what's from a legitimate source and what isn't from a legitimate source. So, and that's just one, I think, of other kind of technological ideas that are emerging from this era about what's real and what isn't. And I also think that we're seeing some local news organizations get creative during this time as well, and thinking about sort of public service journalism differently. So in Chicago, there's a relatively new digital news startup called Block Club Chicago, which is actually doing really terrific work, primarily funded by readers, not by advertisers. And so they just announced last week or 2 weeks ago that they're starting a COVID information desk. And they've staffed it with, I think it's about 3 people. So readers can call in and say, I have a question about COVID, you know, what's the nearest hospital, or where do I go to get tested, or what are the, and so they answer reader questions. I mean, it's kind of back to the early days of newspapering in some ways, where you had, you know, helplines from news organizations. I think that's terrific. I love the idea, and I'm happy to see that happen.
Thank you so much, Tim. We have a few more minutes, and I would like to get back to the issue Alexandra already touched upon when it came to having her talk about, let's say, the people who are still interested to become journalists, who are, would like to consider that as their dream future jobs compared to, let's say, previous decades. And that has, of course, changed. And since I've had the pleasure to be in charge of the media programs of Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung in Latin America close to 20 years ago, and in the Asia Pacific region, we were dealing a lot with these capacity building things, or capacity building for journalists. And I still remember when the whole issue of social media came up, also kind of multitasking for correspondents. For example, we found out it's very often in many media outlets, especially in newspapers, it was much easier to have, let's say, the sports correspondents get adjusted to these new technological things than, for example, the journalists who were dealing with economic affairs or political affairs, especially if they were dealing with these things since 20 years. So to Penny, Tim, to Alexandra, if you would have a look at how journalism capacity building, also journalism programs of universities, how would they need to change given our current situation? What would you suggest? Perhaps let's start with Alexandra.
Yeah, first of all, they really need to get more diverse and attract a much more diverse crowd of young journalists, because there's actually whole segments of society that haven't been addressed in recent years, because the sector has been contracting and very much centralized with major brands, and the smaller brands have gotten lost, or they had to lay off people. So actually there's a lot of academics that have joined the profession, but actually people with different and lower social background, they've been driven out of the profession. So actually journalism has become less diverse in recent years. Also representation of ethnic minorities, of people of color, of women in leadership positions. All these issues haven't been properly addressed, but you need a much more diverse crowd of journalists to produce journalism for diverse audiences. So that's really one thing that I'd really pay attention to, really, going actively recruiting, going out, not waiting for these applications to come in, but actively recruiting in communities where you really feel that need to be represented in the profession.
Thank you so much. Jasmine?
I totally agree. And I can definitely say, if we have young journalist students coming in and I try to convince them to work for us, sometimes they say, oh, local newspaper, that is kind of boring. I want to work for a national one. I want to travel across Europe and not only across Lübeck and so on. But I really feel like we have to tell the young people how exciting can it be to work on the grounds, to be out there and work for a local newspaper, especially now this shows up in those pandemic times, because the best stories are actually on the ground in the local communities. And I feel like it's actually the most exciting time to work for local newspapers. And also sometimes, sorry, just wanted to add, and sometimes they feel like it's boring because they feel that local means only newspaper, only print, but there are so many local newspapers out there, and I guess in the US as well, that are really pushing the digital transformation, that are doing so many things, newspapers, podcasts, all those crazy things that actually must attract young people to become journalists.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. Firstly, I totally subscribe to what you said, but honestly, that hasn't changed. That has always been. When I was a journalist during the 90s, when it came to local news versus being on the big screen at national broadcasters and so on, that has always been a problem. Unfortunately, or not fortunately, but from my point of view, at least that's one thing which hasn't changed. Having the local newspaper fight to have journalists work for them, because I totally agree. They're much closer to the audience, much closer to the people. They report about the real important stories. I totally agree with you. But perhaps, Penny, from your point of view, when it comes to capacity building, future capacity building for future journalists.
Two things. One, if we're looking at recruiting journalists, and I second the notion that it needs to be much more diverse. I became a journalist because I worked on the high school newspaper. The McCormick Foundation out of Chicago has looked at how important that feeder system is down into the junior high and senior high level in encouraging people to think about journalism in a way that most people don't. You grow up saying, I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to be a lawyer, whatever. The second thing is, with people that are already out there, we need to think about lifelong learning. This is a profession that's changing very, very quickly, and we need to stop thinking about you end up with a BA or an MS, and that's your stamp of approval, and you go off to a news organization and finish off your career. We need to think more expansively about both.
Thank you so much. Some final words from you, Tim?
Yeah, I agree completely with everything that's been said about increasing diversity. And I also think it's incumbent upon universities and journalism schools to start early. So we just started a program at Medill that we call Teach for Chicago Journalism. I've just spent the last couple of afternoons with Chicago area journalism advisors to start in the high schools, to start at that level and develop interest in journalism and reporting and writing at an early level, and then recruit from those programs. So anyway, I would encourage other journalism schools to do the same.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, we are running out of time. Please bear with us if you have not been able to answer all your questions. We could have continued, I'm sure, for some more time today. Before we leave the meetings, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to our 4 distinguished panelists, Penny Abernathy, Alexandra Borchardt, Tim Franklin, and Jasmine Off, for your time, your invaluable contributions, and your interesting remarks. I think we've learned a lot. I have learned a lot. Thank you so much. Thank you also to our participants, both in the US as well as in Germany and beyond. Thank you for your attention. Stay safe. And for now, goodbye from Washington, D.C.